I got some questions about thermal shock on that last video, or the coefficient of expansion, which is really just the physics of how things expand and contract at different rates when they're subject to heat. Stuff getting bigger or smaller when it's hot and cold. Part 1 of my installment, part 2 maybe, of You Didn't Know What You Already Know, where I try to relate seemingly daunting, complex topics down to relatable stories and ideas that you already know through your primary experience of just being alive and doing similar stuff. And you might not believe how much you know about this one. I had some questions about putting hot pans in water in the sink after you're done with them. Every material expands at its own rate, its own coefficient of expansion, its COE. When two materials change size at different rates, something has to give. You see this all the time when you pour a hot liquid over ice cubes and they crack real quick. That's when the outside surface of the ice cube is expanding at a quick rate and the inside stays frozen and solid and rigid. These ice cubes cracked when a hot tea was poured over the top of them because the outside layer was warming up and expanding a lot faster than the still frozen interior of each of the ice cubes. The difference in expansion rates caused by the ice's low thermal conductivity, as well as the differences in the coefficient of expansion between the two, creates internal stresses that fracture the cubes. Same thing happens if you're a glass fuser. I took some classes with my friend Kathy. Check back in my videos. I think it's the one I posted probably before this one. You have to have the same COE with the glass that you're working with, because if you try to just like take window pane glass and then take nice bullseye COE 9 glass, I don't know enough about this, you try to put them together and put them in the kiln, like you'll be lucky if they fuse together. I guess if you're very gentle, if you can fuse them together and then cool them, it's still not going to be a nice, perfectly fused piece. You're going to see voids and probably cracks. It's because they're trying to fuse and move against each other, and there's those internal tensions that cause cracking. The same principle in glass fusing is at play in engines and cookware and sidewalks and all facets of life, even bones and medical implants. It's just a matter of scale, and mismatched expansion rates are a silent destroyer. Cast iron offers a great example of how internal grain structure can be perceived by our eyeballs. It's rigid and brittle and basically not ductile at all. You can't bend it. When molten iron cools slowly in a sand mold, that's how these are made, carbon atoms gather into tiny graphite flakes inside the iron matrix. There aren't any stresses in any one place. Those little metal flakes make this metal very impact resistant and wear resistant, excellent at dulling vibration, which means it's really good for engine blocks and old skillets. Cast iron is tough under compression, but really brittle if struck too hard. By contrast, forged or rolled steels, like mild carbon, are stainless, are cooled more quickly and worked over and over again. That aligns their internal grain structures into these long continuous grains. They're long structures that will bend before they break, unlike this. But if you take that same steel and make it red hot and then dunk it into a quench, suddenly you froze its atomic lattice in place. You freeze it in its motion and it's locked in there hard and glass-like. Then quench it rapidly to trap that carbon in a hard crystalline form called martensite. There's a lot of strain on this material, and it's got internal stresses, and it can crack under its own tension, under its own stress. So blades are always tempered afterward. You may have seen these in the knife making shows. That's when they're reheated just enough to relax that internal structure with all the tension in it without softening it too much. And sometimes water cools too fast for many alloys, so they wind up using oil. Oil is used for a softer, gentler quench that doesn't lock those stresses in quite as much. It avoids the thermal shock of the blade. This phenomenon comes to mind when I think about how we in our family play confectioner in the kitchen. We like to make things out of chocolate, make our own candy. Even though now we're talking about playing with sugar and getting the moisture out of the sugar and all of the fats forming crystals inside of chocolate, it's surprisingly similar when you're talking about tempering steel and tempering chocolate. If you've ever worked with chocolate, you know about tempering, even if you don't know that's what the word is. That's when you have to heat it very carefully in order to keep that glossy sheen and the snap that you're looking for. If you're covering up strawberries and you overheat it, it's going to wind up getting brittle and chalky. Bloom, chocolate bloom, is due to fats, the thermal shock in the fats of the chocolate, rather than thermal shock in making steel. When you're making sugar ribbons or the strands, they are often subject to thermal shock and they're very brittle, and the professionals will use heat lamps so that after you make them, you're not just setting them out in ambient room temperature, you've got a slow cool down. And that's just what we do when we're welding cast iron. We preheat the heck out of it to make sure that it's not ambient temperature as we're welding on it. We then make the repair and then bury it in warm sand to cool down slowly. I've known people that have dedicated propane grills. They'll put the part in their grill and they'll actually keep it warm, and they will cool it slowly overnight. It's making sure that all that heat you're blasting into the repair isn't localized. Dissipate the heat slowly to avoid thermal shock at the repair site. I have heard of somebody repairing castings and they thought everything was okay, and they went to turn off the lights at the end of the night and all these castings were on a shelf. You went to walk out the door and you heard a ping. You heard another one, ping. Engines fight a similar battle between metals. Aluminum pistons expand at a much faster rate than the steel cylinders that house them. When an engine is cold, that clearance is tight and the oil is also thick and sluggish, higher viscosity because it's colder. So designers build in just enough space and lubrication to account for those cold starts, to let things warm up gradually without seizing. That's why cold engines need a minute before you drive off. On a related note, windshields can crack if you blast real hot defrost air on them first thing when they're frozen solid. You can crack exhaust manifold by bahaing through puddles when it's already really hot. You know, you know. Cookware has the same rules. Those layered tri-ply pans in most kitchens combine metal with very different coefficients of expansion. Stainless steel for corrosion resistance, aluminum for heat conduction, and sometimes copper for a quick heat up. Those layers are bonded under huge pressure and heat, so they expand and contract together without warping, even after years of stove cycles. But quenching those hot pans in cold water still risks delamination of those layers, permanently distorting the material. That sharp clink sound you hear as the pan is being cooled is its way of telling you it's not happy. I actually have a pan that kind of clinks as it heats or cools. It might be one that I kind of inadvertently quenched myself or overheated. I'm not really concerned about it exploding on me unless it starts being very noticeably warped or starts cooking unevenly on me. And you know what a bimetallic strip is. If you can imagine a sandwich with a material that expands really fast versus a material that does not expand as fast as that, when there is a temperature change and they're bonded, something's got to give, and that means it bends. We use them in switches, like in fire alarms. Sometimes they have bimetallic switches in there, and when the heat gets too much, it bends and it makes contact with a circuit, and that's what trips the alarm and the sprinklers. I don't know how that all works. I know there's a bimetallic strip in there, as well as with thermostat in your house, because it's an actual mechanical thing that turns off your furnace when it reaches a certain temperature, and it's a very, very, very long metallic strip so that it can move more, but there's not enough room for a very long bimetallic strip in your thermostat, so it's turned into a coil, which mechanically opens and closes with temperature changes, and that's what you need for sensing the temperature in your room. They're also used in electric water kettles and in circuit breakers. Surgical implants and prosthetic devices must account for sterilization at very high temperatures and then cooling again with sterile solutions and then placed into a warm body without warping or separating from their coatings. Cryogenics and frozen biopsy samples have to be able to be transported and used without being damaged, and that's where cryogenics comes in. I wonder if I should do a different video on cryogenics. I don't want to be confusing, but it's similar, where they're trying to avoid thermal shock. They just do it super fast cooling so that water crystals don't have a chance to grow inside of the tissue samples. They also have to have the tissue samples just the right size, because if the tissue sample is too big, they're not going to be able to freeze it to the center and then thaw it out at a decent rate without cracking it somewhere or allowing those ice crystals to propagate. It's the ice crystals that grow into the cells and damage the tissue. Okay, I need notes for this. This is too intense without notes. Stress cycles of them being heated and cooled can cause cracks over time. Tiny cracks that are enough to break a circuit. Part of why intense cool and intense heat isn't good for your phone. Moisture and temperature shifts break bonds between the glass and the metal, creating like a crazy cobwebby pattern, which is very similar to crazing on vintage lacquered guitars, like this ghostly cobwebby pattern that happened by accident because of the different expansion rates with the lacquer that was put on them, but now it's a sought-after finish. Same thing as the silver backing coming off of the glass on an old mirror. Just up the road here in Corning, New York, lies one of the greatest success stories ever born of mastering thermal expansion: borosilicate glass. It began in the early 1900s when Corning scientists developed a heat-stable glass for railroad lanterns. They had to survive rain and snow and open flame. One of the scientists took a sample home and gave it to his wife and asked him to bake a pie in it, and she did, and it didn't crack, and that same glass became Pyrex, our household name. And it's a direct descendant of that low expansion glass that now holds the mirrors of our largest telescopes in perfect focus. We would have no Hubble telescope without harnessing thermal expansion. We're staring billions of light years away without blurring our view, all because of low expansion glasses. Also, spaceships depend on materials that are ultra low coefficient of expansion because they are subject to, blazing sun, or the complete opposite, no blazing sun, the freezing vacuum of space. That's a wicked temperature change from it being exposed to the sun to the shadowed cold of space, and they don't twist or warp, and the tiles don't fall off. So the too long didn't read is that we don't quench cast iron pans because of their crystalline structure. You can't flex fast enough to survive that shock. Outer surface cools and contracts, while the inner mass stays expanded and hot within, and it would tear the metal from within. My bonehead cast iron move was when I was cooking outside in the winter. We had this storm that dumped like 2 feet of snow, and I was out here shoveling, and I shoveled past our charcoal grill that was still there. I'm like, wouldn't it be funny to cook some steaks tonight? And so I did, and I was doing onions and peppers in a cast iron skillet. And I went out to get them because I thought they were ready, and I grabbed a hold of them with my pot holder, and halfway up our sidewalk here, I realized that my pot holder was too thin or too wet or something, and it got hotter and hotter. And these things are heavy, especially when they're full, so it was pressing into my hand too, really hot. Picking up my speed trying to get back to the house, and I realized that it is either set the pan down in the snow and probably crack it, or burn the bejeebies out of my hand, and I chose to set it down. And sure enough, when I set it down on the sidewalk, it went ping. Oh my god, shit. That was that. So now it's got a crack down it, but I didn't throw it away. I also don't feel like repairing it, but I do keep it downstairs by the fireplace, and it is our holiday chestnut roasting pan. I've gotten better at repairing cast iron, mostly because I use a silicon bronze welding rod, which is braze welding, and that's a whole lot more ductile than actually repairing it with cast iron rod, meaning it's basically a very high temperature adhesive. But it's a lower temperature melting point than cast iron, meaning that it can melt away under the right conditions. There is such a thing as cast iron welding rod, but it's tricky to work with. It's kind of like welding toothpaste. This is it. This is cast iron welding rod. It's basically a structure match for cast iron base metal. It produces a machinable repair weld. You can build up castings in worn areas, but I do not have the flux for it. I've only used it like twice in my life for realsies. So I guess my takeaway is don't quench anything ever unless you're a blacksmith and you know specifically exactly what you're doing by subjecting that very hot thing to cold thermal shock. That includes cast iron pans and modern layered pans.